I see that we have more folks joining us, and so why don't we go ahead and get started? I'll take your spotlight off, Dr. Harris, and do our welcome. So we'll take a few moments for general welcomes, for introductions of each other and of the centers that are co-sponsoring this event. We'll hear from admissions at Garrett, if any of you are new to theological education or thinking of additional degrees. And then we will all, as panelists, will engage in a conversation and interview with Reverend Dr. Harris. At the end of that, we'll have some time for Q&A. So let me again just welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today to this event. Our event today is co-sponsored by the Center for Ecological Regeneration and the Center for the Church and the Black Experience, as well as the Jerry L. and Mary Joy Stead Center for Ethics and Values. Just a few technology reminders before we get started. This is an online seminar. Some of you are also on campus viewing this webinar live. Participants will be seeing our featured speakers throughout our conversation. You will not be able to see attendees' video and or their chat. Instead, we are using the Q&A function. So if you are on Zoom and you scroll to the bottom, you will see Q&A. You can go ahead and add your questions for us to relay those to Dr. Harris at the end of our interview time. Please, if you are on campus, let either of the Stead Center assistants know what your questions are, and they can go ahead and type those into the Q&A as well. You do not need to log into Zoom to add your questions. Let me take a moment here just to invite Katie Fahey in the Garrett admissions office to also share a greeting.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm on my phone because my computer is not working just right. So if I'm in a funny view, that's why. But thank you so much for having me here today. It's such an honor to be among you and discussing eco-womanism and the current water crisis in Mississippi. Water crises are very close to my heart, being from Michigan. And many of you may remember the Flint water crisis that's still ongoing. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Katie Fahey. I use she, her pronouns, and I get the privilege of being the Director of Admissions and Recruitment at Garrett. And I say privilege because it is. I get to every day be part of events like this that center Black voices, that center God's creation, and that center ways we can be part of transforming the world we live in to be more like the world it was created to be. And I'm so grateful that I've been given a few minutes. And really all I wanted to say as part of this is that if at the end of the day, you are feeling hungry for more, if you are feeling like you're left with more questions than answers, if you feel like you need to do something, those are all reasons why people come to seminary. Those are all reasons why people come to Garrett. And if you're interested in pursuing a full degree, a further degree, auditing a course, we want to walk with you in that journey. So I will be dropping a few links in the chat, and I may need some help doing that just because of my computer situation. But if you have questions or anything, feel free to send me an email or give me a call. And if you want to learn more about our degrees and programs, you can either look at our website or just chat with me. We do have some upcoming events and deadlines coming up as well for scholarship applications. And we want to make sure that you get the best scholarship that you can get so you can come here and do the ministry you're called to do. All right, I'll just turn that back over to Dr. Ott and our presenters. And thank you again for letting me be here today.
Thank you so much for joining us. I did drop in the link to the admissions website page and where to apply, but please, add others. So as folks have already said, and I have said, I'm Kate Ott. I'm the director of the Stead Center for Ethics and Values here at Garrett. The mission of the Stead Center is to promote teaching and research along a range of theological topics and moral issues. It's committed to drawing upon and promoting thoughtful conversation among the church, academy, and society in a way where no sharp distinction is drawn between theory and practice. As the center continues to grow, we invite you to join us in the development of social ethics resources in response to current events, theological school curricular needs, and long-standing moral inquiries. Let me now introduce Reverend Dr. Reginald Blunt to say a bit about the Center for the Church and the Black Experience. Dr. Blunt. You're muted.
All righty. Back at it. Thank you, Dr. Ott. And good afternoon to everyone who has come to share with us today. I'm Dr. Reggie Blunt, Director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience here at Garrett-Evangelical. And for the last 52 years, the Center for the Church and the Black Experience has empowered and trained generations of Black leaders for the church and society at large. And it has and continues to be a citadel of teaching, research, action, and reflection on Black life and Black church life, as well as committed to training seminarians and pastors to be pastoral, priestly, prophetic leaders of leaders. And I am grateful to be a part of this conversation and to have Dr. Melanie Harris to be with us. And so with that, I want to pass this on to my colleague, Dr. Timothy Eberhardt, who is the director of the Center for Ecological Regeneration here at Garrett.
Dr. Blunt, thank you for the handoff. And Dr. Ott, thank you so much for the invitation to co-sponsor this vitally important conversation and to be the catalyst for a collaborative event with our many centers. Womanist scholars have long insisted that in our struggles for a more just society, multiple critical lenses are needed: race, class, gender, environment, and more. And in that sense, the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi can really be described as a series of compounding crises. White flight from an urban area driven by the logics of white supremacy, following the desegregation of schools in the 60s and 70s. And then the fraying of public utilities that have been underfunded for decades because of anti-government political sentiment. And then more recently, a major flooding event amplified by a destabilizing climate that ensures that we will continue to experience events like this. Then calculated efforts now to privatize public goods like water, like utilities in the wake of a disaster. And then now the emergence of yet another sacrifice zone, all made possible by the logics of systemic racism. And, you know, there really is no one better than Dr. Melanie Harris. There really is no perspective better than Ecowomanism to help us see these connections, to insist on their interrelatedness, but then to respond appropriately, to respond effectively and faithfully. And so the Center for Ecological Regeneration is honored. We're thrilled to be part of the conversation and really appreciate the invitation. Dr. Ott, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more. And I'm not saying that just because Dr. Harris is one of my very, very close friends, but because she is absolutely brilliant. And when I thought we need to talk about this issue, we on campus in a wider conversation need to bring the eco-womanist framework to the crisis-driven issues we are dealing with when it comes to the environment. I could not think of anyone else better to lead us in that conversation. So I would like to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Melanie Harris. Dr. Harris is professor of Black feminist thought and womanist theology, jointly appointed with Wake Forest School of Divinity and the African American Studies program at Wake Forest University. Dr. Harris is also the director of the Food, Health, and Ecological Wellbeing program. Her research and scholarship critically examine intersections between race, religion, gender, and environmental ethics. She's author of many scholarly articles and a leader of national workshops, too many to name at this point. But I will name her books. Her books include Gifts of Virtue, Alice Walker, and Womanist Ethics. She is the co-editor, along with some other esteemed scholar, of Faith,
Dr. Kate Ott.
of Faith, Feminism, and Scholarship, The Next Generation. And the primary book that we will be talking about today, and I hope each of you will pick up after this conversation, is Ecowomanism, Earth Honoring Faith. Dr. Harris, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us for this important conversation. We hope that this interview style of dialogue will prompt some insightful discussion, but please feel free, my co-sponsors of this event, as well as Dr. Harris, to interrupt that style, to have free-flowing conversation as you feel called, perhaps sparked by a particular question or response. And just a last reminder to participants, please put your questions into the Q&A function so that after our questions, as co-sponsoring organizations and people committed deeply to these issues, that we can hear from you as well. I will hand it back over to Dr. Blunt to ask our first question.
Well, all right, let's get this started. And again, Dr. Harris, thank you so much for being with us today. So before we get started talking about the specifics of responding to the water crisis that's happening in Jackson, Mississippi, Dr. Harris, can you give us a brief overview of Ecowomanism?
Thank you so much, Dr. Blunt, and thank you to Dr. Kate Dodd and to Dr. Tim Eberhard for the invitation to join you here in the community at Garrett. It is indeed an honor to be with you in this particular day and time, and I'm grateful for the Theological Education Center there that really is at the precipice of radical inclusion and really important work in social justice. The Stead Center is indeed a home for these kinds of conversations. So it's my honor to be a member of this particular conversation, and certainly a member of this community on today. Ecowomanist thought is unique in that it really is a bridge between environmental ethics and womanist thought. One way to think about it is as these two disciplines or discourses are in conversation with each other. It might be defined as an approach to environmental studies or environmental ethics more specifically that is really shaped by the vision of women of African descent, so that across the African diaspora, there are particular ways in which women of African descent have contributed to climate justice, have actually raised different ideas and different voices and come up with different solutions to be able to meet communities, particularly communities of color, in the midst of environmental crisis with some solutions. There is indeed the opportunity in eco-womanist thought to look more specifically at what does it mean to be a person of African descent, a being of African descent, grappling with the reality of climate injustice, in part because as a person of color, and certainly a person of African descent, it is the case that not only are we dealing with the effects of environmental injustice, but deep, deep effects, of course, of racism, classism, sexism, heterosexism, and a variety of different oppressions that really find a root in the logic of white supremacy and the logic of domination more broadly. So eco-womanism really begins to open the door for us to feel and also to see the intersections of all of the issues that come to bear, sometimes literally in the lives and in the bodies of Brown and Black communities. I'm grateful for the framework as we kind of think about Jackson, Mississippi and the water crisis there. And also just want to remind us that eco-womanism, while it comes out of a kind of womanist tradition and environmental ethics discourse in the United States, it is by no means limited to that place and those voices. It's important to remember that not just across the African diaspora, but also the Asian diaspora, the Latino and Latina diaspora, that actually all aspects of the earth, every community is represented in some way by an eco-womanist frame, and that there is an understanding in eco-womanism that we are all connected, that this kind of web of connection, or in the words of Thich Nhat Hanh, a Buddhist monk, this reality of interbeing really does present us with the opportunity to start thinking about how to problematize the walls between us, the barriers or the cultural lines even between us, while also recognizing that some of those walls have been put into place by white supremacy, and they are held in place by white supremacy. Having the courage to be able to open those walls, open those doors to and with each other, allows us to see the fact that we are all beings on the same planet. That is a radically theological view, to actually see that we are all connected. And that's one of the most important contributions of eco-womanism, whether one identifies as a person of African descent or not, to actually begin to wrestle with the theological framework whereby we actually all are connected. Thank you so much, Dr. Blunt. I hope that that helps us going, at least in the conversation.
Yes,
I think
thank
that gets
you.
us started, yes.
Yes, yeah, and I know, you know, having read Ecowomanism, Earth Honoring Faiths, you can hear and you can read the framework, but until you actually apply the framework, I feel as though there are oftentimes, there's so many pieces to it that one can miss. And so as we turn specifically to talking about the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, right, I mean, there's a variety of water crises happening all over the world. You know, most recently, there's the Hurricane Fiona that hit Puerto Rico, and the loss of power, which then caused issues with sanitation, with clean drinking water, with just the pressure to get the water to places. And who knows, perhaps in the next few days, those same problems will repeat themselves in Florida as we see the hurricane move over, the Hurricane Ian, I believe, move over. So some water crises are caused primarily by what we would term climate change, right? And of course, that's caused by humans, right? So the connection to that can be tenuous, and I don't know why some people, but some people still dispute it. So as we think about that, how does an eco-womanist framework help us assess and better understand what's unique about what's happening in Jackson, Mississippi, that yes, has climate implications, and this most recent understanding of what's happening and most recent events was impacted by you know, by a certain kind of storm and water flooding. But in comparison to some of those larger issues, say like a hurricane, or droughts, or, you know, contamination from industries, how does the Eco-Womanist framework help us understand specifically what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi?
That's a helpful question. Thank you so much. The reality of what's a big part of what's happening is the institutional racism that has been a part of Mississippi's life and also Southern life for a very, very, very long time. One of the gifts of eco-womanist framework then is that it really does push us into this historical eco-memory. It asks us the question about how did the root of the institutional racism actually begin, or what is the origin of that, the history of that form of racism. What we're talking about here is the awareness that Jim and Jane Crow also came out of the heart places of Mississippi. And beyond that, that the transatlantic slave trade, of course, was deeply, deeply embedded in Mississippi, specifically throughout the South and the United States, of course, and globally, but certainly in Mississippi in profound ways, so that we do still hear the voice of Nina Simone singing, "Mississippi, goddamn." There is a kind of form of racism that is so vicious, so violent, so real in Mississippi that in some ways it's in the water. That is to say that there is a deep, deep commitment to maintaining the structure of racism, not just in that place, but throughout the South, that has been difficult to let go of or shed. The economic realities of the structure in place, the fact that there are pipes, for example, throughout the water system in Jackson, Mississippi that are too old to repair, the fact that there are fewer people who are willing to work, but also workers who are willing to continue to try to stay with the water system there. Those are all evidences of a number of different issues happening at the same time: economic injustice, racial injustice, gender injustice, when it comes to actually looking at the impact that bad water or poisonous water can actually have on women and women's bodies in particular, and the kind of crises that that can present then, particularly for women who are pregnant, in the way that we begin to think about prenatal care and the importance of water in the womb. The crisis in Jackson, and when we think about it from an eco-womanist lens, begins to open up the door for us to investigate the history of racism and the history of institutional racism down there. And that invites a different conversation. It's not just a conversation, although it is an important piece of the conversation to look at the economic instability, the numbers of high unemployment, for example, the reality that it's hard to find and keep a job in Mississippi because of the kind of institutional racism that's a part of the kind of structure and life and society there. But it also invites us to take a look at the reality of the history of segregation there and how that has impacted generations upon generations upon generations. So in the eco-womanist frame, we really do consider taking a look or honoring the experience as a first step of the eco-womanist method. Honoring the experience, honestly, of the person who may in fact be in the kitchen with brown water flowing from the sink in this particular moment, not just recognizing the reality of their theology and their belief system in the moment, but also taking a deep look at how that person institutionally, historically got to that place. It is the case for many people of color, and specifically African-American families, that Mississippi roots begin with the slave trade. They begin with the realities of generations upon people being ripped from a homeland in different countries and different spaces in Africa and throughout the Caribbean, and kind of brought here, obviously, against their will. The reality is that in the United States of America, it is in the South, in Texas in particular, still difficult to teach about the reality and the harshness of chattel slavery. For example, textbooks in Texas, at least, have begun to change the language in order to try to tell a different truth about the realities of the harshness of American slavery. the mapping of white supremacy onto the realities of harshness of slavery is a really important to take a look at. And when we take a look at the actual honoring people's experiences, taking a look at the actual history of institutional racism and environmental racism, we begin to peel back the reality of white supremacy and actually take a look at whether and how white privilege can be shared or is being shared or even being thought of as we meet crisis to crisis. So I'll pause there and just take a step back to certainly present a little bit more on the Ecowomanist method. The first step, indeed, it really does look at honoring experience and invites us to actually go a little deeper there to begin to critically reflect on that experience. The kind of second movement of the entire method begins to allow us to begin to change some of the, or at least think about changing some of the language, coming up with different frames, different perspectives to be in conversation or in dialogue with others. And then the third phase of the method really does begin to look at the actions that we can take towards environmental justice, having taken seriously some of the experience and in a lot of times the intersectional lines of justice issues happening at the same time.
So, Dr. Harris, I have your wonderful book here with me. It's a book that in the Ecological Theology course offered here at Garrett this semester, we'll be reading in a few weeks. It's a book that has been deeply impactful for me, and I know many prior students on many levels. On one level, the invitation to explore one's own eco-autobiography, which is an invitation I've taken up and have invited others to as well. I'm going to actually read here briefly from page 7 of your book. You write, following a methodological process of uncovering one's own environmental familial roots and spiritual connections, the first step of an eco-womanist method begins with investigating one's family story and connection with the earth. Would love to hear more about your sense of why this is important. How might an eco-autobiographical approach, how might drawing on our deep, even ancestral eco memories help us at moments like this? And how might it connect with some of the systemic and intersectional issues that you've been naming for us so far? Thank you so much, Dr. Eberhard. I appreciate the pointing to a specific page in any book. This is good for conversation. I remember as a graduate student learning how important it was to bring everybody to the same page and frame one's question from that. So thank you for modeling that again. The first step of the Eco-Womanist method really does invite each of us, those of us who are reading, but also those of us who are coming into the conversation, to take an account of our own social location, so to speak, but our own location historically and our relationship with the earth. And that's done, as you just described, in large part, to be able to get a sense of what brings one to the table of environmental justice. It is an invitation essentially for us to uncover our embedded theology about the earth and to ask ourselves what brings us or connects us to the earth in the first place. In this particular world, in the paradigm of environmental movement and environmental studies in the Western world, it is the case that most of environmental studies has been separated into particular camps: preservationist, conservationist. In these particular camps, it's very rare to see the voices of people of color woven into the meta-narrative of environmental studies, so that there is an assumption, a meta-assumption, a white male European lens on environmental studies that assumes that the connection that one has with the earth is specifically towards the end of either preserving the earth,
conserving the earth, or using the earth, being in conversation with the earth, so to speak, or relationship with the earth, so to speak, so as to be able to use or dominate the earth. This word domination should, of course, ring a bell in those of us who are oriented in the Christian tradition, because oftentimes that Genesis passage, that first passage, speaking about the relationship between God, humans, and the earth, suggests that humans were created by God to dominate, to have control over, to have dominion over the earth. Now, the true translation, right, and understanding of that word actually is more along the lines of stewardship or partnership, that humans ought to be considered by in partnership with the earth according to God's divine plan. But this is because of the role of the logic of domination and how tempting it is to fall into that trap, and the prevalence of white supremacy in our society. It's actually quite challenging to hold on to a kind of mutual view, or a view of relationality between the earth and human beings. So right there, just by uncovering one's embedded theology or connection with the earth, one can actually uncover where you want to work first. It is the case that for most Christian thought, and particularly for traditional Christian thought, and in the work of religion and ecology, many of us have actually been shaped to not pay attention to the relationship with the earth, in part because in many ways we've been kind of trained to think of the earth as less than or devalued, to even allow the earth to be considered non-divine. So then when we have these powerful experiences with the stars, or with the sun, or with the moon, or running and jogging outside, or feeling a peace like no other, peace like a river in nature, for some of us, it's actually difficult for us to actually consider that the divine may be experienced, or may be being experienced through nature itself, through the earth itself. For eco-womanist thought, and for many peoples and communities of color, it is the case that the cosmology or the theology is connected. That is to say that there is an assumption of the mutuality. There is an assumption of a relationship between the earth, the divine, and the humans. So for African and African American religious traditions, it's very, very common to find the framework of an African cosmology, whereby the earth, the divine, whether it's ancestors or God or Jesus, and humans, the earth, the divine, and humans are all actually interwoven into this kind of circle of life. And that when an environmental crisis happens, or when climate change is happening, that circle is disjointed in some way or another. So it is the understanding by many great African scholars. I mentioned the work of John Mbiti just because his work has been so central to the work of African and African American cosmologies, whereby we really understand that if you were to do something against the environment, if you were to pollute a river, that you would actually anger an ancestor. And then in angering that ancestor, you disrupt this union or harmony in this cosmology, in this kind of divine circle of life. So it makes more sense then to honor the environment as best as possible. In different African indigenous religious traditions, such as Condomblé, there are particular ancestors or orishas who actually embody this or our personality around this particular element of honoring the earth. The earth is understood as sacred in many Native American traditions, for example, and in Native American spirituality, as in many indigenous Latino or Latina religious understandings. That's a different way of getting into the conversation about the relationship. And in fact, if these are the kind of theologies, cosmologies alive in a particular person, then the way that they come to approach environmental crises such as water pollution is very different, very different. It is not necessarily about the issue of how do we privatize water, but rather how is water being honored or not in the process, even of trying to make sure that people have clean water. So I'll pause there. Thank you so much, Dr. Eberhard, for the question, really looking at eco-memory, and we can go deeper.
Yeah, thank you. Such a rich answer and filled with so much for continued reflection. And maybe just a quick follow-up around connecting this methodology, this approach to a congregational setting. I'm curious about how our religious leaders might help nurture and foster a deeper sense of not just personal, but communal, congregational story with local habitats, regions, ecosystems. And I'm wondering if you think the development, the curation, or the recovery and celebration of these deeper cosmologies, these more holistic, integrated narratives might be of service to us in this time of ongoing crisis. I wonder how they might help us protect and sustain and find the energies to resist. So curious about a congregational application of eco-memory, eco-autobiography.
I appreciate the question very much. Thank you very much. I am often reminded by my dear close friend, Dr. Kate Ott, about how to make sure that the teaching and that what we teach and speak is indeed applicable to the people who are in front of us. And for many of us, that is seminary students who are indeed living in congregational life and leading in those ways. So I thank you for that. Kate Ott has been there just long enough. That's good to be able to get that in. I'm grateful for the question, and I appreciate so much here the work and voice of Dr. Reggie Blunt, in part because even today in the United States of America, the kind of conversations around environmental justice show up differently in white Protestant churches than they do in many cases in Black churches or Latino or Asian churches. And so I will, simply state that, and we can get into that a little deeper. One of the realities at this point in the kind of COVID endemic is that for many congregations, we have had to have church outside, in part because it was safer to be able to commune in nature and to actually have worship in nature. So for many churches who have had not a real connection to ecological justice, they are witnessing, just by having survived the COVID pandemic, how important it has been to be able to worship outside. So beyond the kind of frustrations of technology or having the right kind of audio equipment and not being able to hear necessarily, there is a real sense in which congregations are now living in truth, in recognizing God in the outdoors, God in nature. It's almost as if God has presented this situation so that everyone actually has to answer the question about our relationship with the divine. We are confronted with the reality of death and loss. And in many cases, we cannot go indoors inside our own individual spaces to grieve. In many cases, we have had to grieve outdoors. We have had to grieve in a completely different way, in a completely different community, particularly for those of us who lost loved ones during the pandemic. This suggests several different openings for churches and congregations to, one, be able to make a commitment to environmental justice by essentially opening space for Bible studies about eco-justice, to ask questions about how our own theology can speak into the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, the realities of not having power in Puerto Rico. So beyond the kind of idea of connecting mission to mission, one church in Puerto Rico, for example, and another church in North Carolina, for example, even beyond having a relationship with a church, there is also this deeper kind of invitation to ask ourselves, what is it we believe about why it is important to see God in earth? And in some cases, to see God as earth, or to see the earth as God. So these particular openings open up larger conversations around panentheism, pantheism, and what is the theology that's in flow either by the congregation themselves, whether it's ordained by the denomination or not, embodied by the leader, whether it's in keeping with the kind of book of discipline or not. These are very live conversations, in part because for many of us grappling with theology in our own personal lives, it is helpful to have a community to have said, this is our commitment to taking care of the earth itself. Beyond that, there are lots of different opportunities and lots of great organizations, including Green Faith, that will actually help and walk alongside churches who can take an eco audit of the church to actually make suggestions about how one might reduce one's carbon footprint, for example, how one might begin to consider how to change the building, how one might consider doing in particular solidarity work with other congregations and other organizations in one city who are also working around global justice. And I'll say just one final one that comes to me, which is an obvious one. And we've seen this modeled in some of the organizations that Dr. Ott will share with us in terms of what's happening in Jackson, but to actually be a host for people who do not have water, to be a host space for people who do not have clean water. And to think about, what does it mean, right? That one may be serving a community or actually in a community where we are forced into a space to think about how many bottles of water to purchase and the kind of carbon footprint each of those bottles may actually make in order to provide clean water for the human beings in the neighborhoods that we are in and the neighborhoods that we serve.
I'm going to get this mute and unmute thing right. But Dr. Harris, thank you so much for what you have shared so far. I wish you could have a sense of what's going on inside my head with so many questions and so many thoughts that's spinning around. I'm grateful for what you've shared around our misinterpretation around dominion and domination, and that it really is a call to us for greater stewardship of one another and greater stewardship of the earth. And one of the classes that I teach, and we just met yesterday, is Christian Education in the African American Experience. And just yesterday, as we were wrestling through some of the material, a question essentially got posed as to what are we not teaching in Christian education in our churches that would cause us to not be good stewards of one another, and bringing that more closer to home to this conversation, cause us not to be better stewards of the earth. And so what might you teach, or what might you say more specifically to the Black community as to their role and responsibilities? And if I could then add a part two, what might be similar or different that you might say to other communities that are non-Black?
Thank you so much, Dr. Blunt. Thank you so much. This is an important question because the gift of eco-womanism is that it can speak to a variety of different audiences. So just in writing the book, but also sharing conversation with lots of different student bases, I understand that a part of the gift of eco-womanism is this real deep reckoning with racism and institutional racism, because by its very nature, eco-womanism also presents an anti-racist frame. It pushes particularly white congregations and white people into re-examining their own embedded white supremacy, their own uninterrogated or implicit biases about Black peoples, African peoples, and peoples of color. That in itself can open up the door for real work in dismantling white supremacy, and particularly for the work of ecological justice, open the doors for interracial work with and for the planet. So I'm thinking about opportunities to garden together, for example, or to provide food for communities or neighborhoods, or even water to communities. When we actually partner with cross-culturally, cross-racial groups, oftentimes we do so with this invitation to be all earth keepers and earth justice keepers. But we're not always invited to actually get to know each other a little deeper, to actually look at the environmental histories and stories of each other's families. So that there is often the case where you'll have the descendants of sharecroppers working alongside people who were owners of land, who actually created the economic instability and patterns and structure of sharecropping. Without there being any conversation between the two, oftentimes there is enough of an acknowledgement of the earth to be able to bring those both sets of descendants into at least some conversation. The harder work is actually to be in healing conversation or reconciling conversation. And then the even harder work is to start to be in reparations with each other. That too is the work of environmental justice. And that kind of interracial or racial justice work is a deep, deep part of the eco-womanist frame. And for communities of color, particularly for Black churches, the conversation around environmental justice can be very different. It can be a healing conversation around how many peoples of color, particularly younger generations, have actually been taken away from the land, from the earth. So when we look at the pattern of the Great Migration, and the work of Bell Hooks here is so helpful, Touching the Earth in her book, Sisters of the Yam, as well as in a lot of her other work. She talks about how, as someone who does not have a green thumb, has had to learn again how to connect with plants and connect with earth. And she goes through in her own eco story the history of the Great Migration and how it showed up in her family from the South to the North, in her case at that time, living in an apartment in New York City. And the kind of agricultural memory that's lost during that time in an effort for Black families to survive. That there is a way in which the racial trauma of surviving Jim and Jane Crow was one attempt to make it through the trauma or to deal with the trauma was to forget, to disremember. So that there are generations of African-American youth even now who don't know what cotton looks like, because it has been such an important part of their parents and grandparents and great-great-grandparents' story. A part of their journey towards healing was the thought that if we can forget the touch and feel of cotton, I'm saying that in Winston-Salem, as Haynes is right down the road here. But if we can forget the touch and feel of cotton, then we will somehow protect the next generation. Forgetting and not feeling the touch and feel of cotton, forgetting and not feeling the touch of earth or dirt, the forgetting and not hearing the real tone of trees and our communing nature with trees can actually silence a very important healing aspect of an African American or a person of color. Much of the spirituality in African Indigenous, but also even in Black churches, is connected to the earth. So we think about this amazing thinker and Christian mystic, Howard Thurman. It is instructive that he tells not just the stories of his grandmother and the kind of reworking of the scripture that she does is creating of a healthy theology for herself and for her family, but that there is a real way in which he invites us into this reality of building one's faith, and the faith formation comes as a result of talking to and being with the earth. Rose gardens, laying down and communing with trees, being able to be at peace, away from the realities of police brutality, away from the realities of constant racism, away from the realities in his time of lynching, but to reframe a completely different experience with trees. That's an invitation, particularly for Black churches. It is not just to be able to feed the hungry and to clothe the naked, to provide water for those who do not have clean water, but it is really an opportunity for us to reawaken our connection with the earth as to recover our connection with the earth, to be able to see the glory of strength in the hands of Black peoples, Black farmers, women, men, and all those with different gender expressions, the strength to be able to carry on, even in the midst of radical white supremacist society and realities, even in the midst of entire communities of people who do not believe that Black and brown lives matter. There is something unique about repairing our relationship with the earth, particularly for Black churches, that actually emboldens the spirituality, clarifies the spiritual truth. And I would say, I think along with Chris Carter and James Cone and many womanist theologians, that clarifying our connection with the earth actually clarifies our theology. So that belt theology becomes real. Black environmental liberation theology becomes real. And Ecowomanism also becomes a real way to live out the Christian faith.
Dr. Harris, thank you for that, for all that you've given us today. As we come to our last few minutes, we do have a question by one of the attendees. We'll see if we have time, if there are other questions, especially for those on campus at Garrett, if you'd like to let someone there know from the Stead Center, they can go ahead and enter your question so that we can see it here in our online space. But one of the attendees asks if you would share your perspective regarding the correlation between our stewardship of our bodies and the stewardship of the earth from a biblical perspective. As you've already said some things about the interpretation of dominion, but what might other interpretations biblically relate to both bodies and the earth in that sense? And I'll pop back in a moment if there is another question so that you can see when that comes up.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Ott. I am sitting with the question, particularly around biblical perspective. It's very common for a theological ethicist to give full rein and honor very deeply, reverence very deeply the work of biblical studies to the biblical scholar. So I will say I'm not a biblical scholar as I approach this question. I am one who does have a devotional relationship with the Bible. And so I do use the Bible in my everyday practice of Christian faith. Having said that, one of the most important kind of eco-womanist framings for this relationship between the body and the planet, or the body of the planet, is this relationship between self-care and planetary care. That in the work of Bell Hooks and Alice Walker also reflects this very deeply, that until the earth is free, no one is free. So that even as we fight for the bodies of Black and Brown peoples to be honored and respected in our society, we are also inviting ourselves to honor the body of the earth. So then we consider food justice, for example, and even the hard questions of interrogating what it is we put in our bodies, how we actually situate our bodies and how we view our bodies. There is a deep invitation towards wholeness, the same wholeness that we might have in a truly deep and beautiful ecological vision. An invitation to that wholeness for our own bodies. This suggests a deep awakening around slowing down, not putting so much pressure on ourselves, and leaning out of perfectionism as a model of being. Now, this is a strange thing for an academic scholar to say, but it is the case that by taking on this real deep connection or commitment to self-care, that one is also deeply committing oneself to caring or wholeness of the planet and walking away from white supremacist ways of being. This kind of connection or the normative hierarchies that are part of white supremacy. To take care of oneself, to truly honor one's body, particularly, and also honor the bodies of people of color in this society and around the world, is an act of nonviolence, is an act of justice. And my estimation is an act towards planetary wholeness and planetary care. So that means something beyond brushing your teeth and washing your face every day, right? It actually means reimagining oneself as Imago Dei. It actually means really opening the self to recognize that the go, 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 do, normative in American society, the ways in which we commodify ourselves and each other, that these are actually not healthy for the planet.
Dr. Harris, oh, we do have one more question. And I will take this one. We're going to take 2-3 extra minutes. We'll stay on the screen with you and we'll finish that out after we ask, but I would love to get this last one in there. When faced with, as you say, the deep commitment to continue to disrupt, to the deep commitment to the structures of racism that still perpetuate today, is it actually possible to ethically practice Christianity in the United States? That might be way too much for just 2 minutes. But how's there just some thoughts on that for us?
This is a beautiful question, and Dr. K. knows me very well in that she knows that some of the answer to this question comes in my commitment to comparative religious thought and interfaith dialogue. And so I think the answer is yes, it is possible. And it is only possible in conversation and community and dialogue with people of other faiths and other traditions. So in my own work, I do a lot of work in Buddhist Christian dialogue and have found Buddhism particularly important because of the ecological vision that is and reverence for the earth that is mapped into that religious tradition as well. But there is something deeper about the gift of Buddhism for Christian thinking and for Christian living and practice, that this kind of devotional care and real commitment to slowing down helps us to really sit with the full history of Christianity and its colonialism and its power and its empire, in its violence and attachment to violence. And putting the conversation in front of us between Buddhism and Christianity, just as one example, one can begin to see that the ebb and flow of nonviolence that is normative and deeply held in Buddhism can also help Christians come to that space of nonviolence. In my experience, although my study of Islam is not as deep, Muslim and Christian conversations and relationships can be deeply, deeply healing, particularly in the United States of America, because we are still in September. And for many of us, we are still living in a post-September 11th world. And finally, particularly for Indigenous religious traditions, mostly the ones that I am honored to be a part of, African, it is crucial to understand, particularly as an African-American Christian, that so many of the Christian roots, so much of the power of Black thought and Black religion is rooted in the dance and the feet and the motion and the movement of Black dance and art by the drum, and the commitment to hearing that beat of Ashe, the commitment to life in spite that comes from the African drum. And that too is an interfaith, interreligious, and sometimes intra-religious reality. When we come down to our drum beat of heart, we often find the same beat in the earth.
Thank you for taking that very last question and for what you shared with us in it. In this, I couldn't have found a more poignant way for you to help us see why something like ethics and values and ecological regeneration and the church and the Black experience should be talking to each other, and that we have common work to do. So we so deeply appreciate you helping us do that work today. I do want to let folks know that, and then I'll give my colleagues a moment to say their things as well, that we have put in the chat for folks links directly to organizations in Jackson, Mississippi. So while you might be doing work in your own neighborhoods or in your own faith communities, please consider getting more information on what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi, and ways perhaps you individually or your community can partner with the communities there that are doing this work on the ground. We don't have this discussion only as an academic discussion. We have it as a way to move ourselves towards more ethical action for our neighbors, for the planet, for our larger environment. So thank you, Dr. Harris, for helping us do that today. And my colleagues, would you like to add anything?
I'll just quickly express my deep gratitude and appreciation for the wisdom, the expanding of perspective. We live in such a time of deep transition, of an age of multiple logics of domination that are wreaking such havoc and have for centuries. And so the depth of perspective and the steadiness of guidance in this time toward what we still hope and pray for of a new creation, a just order of social relationships. I could not be more grateful for your time spent with us and the hope that you've given to us.
So my colleagues took everything that I would say. And so let me just say ditto to what they have shared, and definitely key into what Dr. Ott has shared about you helping to also help us be able to demonstrate the alignment of what each of our centers are trying to accomplish and what we can do together. And so thank you.
Thank you all very much, Dr. Blunt, Dr. Eberhard, Dr. Ott. It has been an honor, and it is an honor to be on the planet with you in this time. I'm so grateful for your bravery and want to affirm your courage in stepping into the light, but doing something radically inclusive. And it is the case that so many voices and hearts need the kind of connection that you are developing and merging into. So I'm grateful. There is lots of healing and salvific work here.
Dr. Harris, your sharing of wisdom has been a blessing to us today. Thank you. Thank you. And we apologize for not getting to the last question in the chat, but that's food for thought for all of us who have been here. Continue to think about the ecological and economic considerations as we continue to work towards ending white supremacy, especially in the United States. So thank you for your wisdom today, Dr. Harris, and thank you to my colleagues for joining me in this endeavor.
Thank you, Dr. Ott, for the invitation. Good to be with you.